A few months ago, I started working late nights at an office downtown. The building had an underground parking garage that employees could use after hours. At first, I liked it. My car was always safe and it was convenient. But after what happened, I avoided at all costs. It was a Friday night, just past midnight. I'd stayed late to finish a project, and by the time I left, the building was nearly empty. When I stepped into the elevator to head down to the garage, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The parking levels were usually well lit, but that night, half of the lights were out, leaving long stretches of the lot in shadow. My car was parked near the back, in one of those darker areas. I told myself it was just my imagination making things seem worse than they were, so I walked briskly toward my car, trying not to think about it. As I approached, I heard something. It was faint at first, like the shuffle of shoes on concrete. I stopped and listened, but it went silent. My nerves were already on edge, so I hurried to unlock my car. That's when I noticed it. A few rows over in the far corner of the garage, a figure stood perfectly still, partially obscured by one of the concrete pillars. I couldn't make out any details, just that it was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, like they were watching me. I tried to convince myself it was another late-night worker or maybe a security guard, but something about the way they stood there, not making any noise or moving, felt wrong. I quickly got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I watched them, I noticed the women get out of the car and walk to the first door, onto the porch. I got out of the car and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space, I glanced back at the figure. They were gone. I drove up the ramp to exit the garage, but when I reached the gate, the arm wouldn't lift. I swiped my access card several times, but it wouldn't work. Frustrated, I called building security, but no one answered. That's when I saw the figure again, standing at the far end of the lot, facing me. I don't know why, but I froze. My instinct was to floor it and get out of there, but the gate was still down, trapping me. I looked back at the figure, but they were gone again. I decided to get out of the car and manually try the exit gate. The control panel was a simple mechanism. Sometimes it malfunctioned and needed to be reset. As I fiddled with it, I heard footsteps echoing in the distance. They were slow and deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but the garage was empty. I could still hear the footsteps, though. They sounded like they were circling me, even though there was no one there. Finally, the gate lifted. I jumped back into my car, slammed the door shut, and sped out of the garage. I didn't stop until I was halfway home. The next day, I decided to ask the building's security team about what had happened. They were dismissive at first, saying it was probably just a glitch in the system or a homeless person who had wandered in. But when I mentioned the figure I'd seen, one of the guards went quiet. He pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "You're not the first person to say something like that," he said. "We've had reports over the years, people seeing someone down there late at night. Thing is, when we check the cameras, there's never anyone there." I felt a chill run down my spine. That night, I had to stay late again. I almost parked on the street, but it was raining and I didn't want to walk in the cold. So, against my better judgment, I parked in the garage. This time, I parked near the entrance, under a working light. The night passed without incident, and when I finally headed to my car, I felt relieved. Maybe the guard was right. Maybe it was all just paranoia. But as I got into my car and started the engine, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. It was the same figure standing a few rows back, completely still, facing my car. I didn't wait. I floored it, speeding out of the garage and onto the street. When I looked back, there was no one there. I quit that job a week later. To this day, I have no idea who or what I saw in that garage. I've read stories about haunted places, but I never thought I'd experience something like that. Now whenever I park, I always make sure it's above ground. No matter how well lit or secure an underground garage might seem, I'm not taking any chances. A few months ago, I started a new job at a tech company. It was a decent gig, but the hours were brutal. Sometimes I wouldn't leave the office until well past midnight. The building had an underground parking garage, which I used almost every night. It felt safe, well, little nightmare. Well, after what happened, I avoid underground parking entirely. It started on a Thursday night. I was one of the last to leave the office as usual. The elevator ride down to the garage was quiet, and when the doors opened, I was met with the familiar hum of fluorescent lights. My car was parked a few rows away, close to the far wall. As I walked to my car, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. They weren't mine. I stopped walking, but the sound continued for another second before stopping too. I glanced around but didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the sound of my own steps echoing, but when I unlocked my car and got in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked my mirrors. Nothing. The next night, it happened again. This time, as I walked to my car, I heard what sounded like a faint whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't make out any words, but it was unmistakable. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source, but the garage was empty. By the time I reached my car, my heart was racing. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when I saw it, just for a split second. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement near one of the pillars behind me. It was too quick to make out any details, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I sped out of the garage, trying to convince myself that I was just tired and imagining things. The following Monday, I told one of my co-workers, Kevin, about the strange things I'd been experiencing in the garage. He laughed it off, saying the underground lot had always given him the creeps too. But then he mentioned something odd. "Did you hear about what happened there a couple of years ago?" he asked. Apparently, a former employee had gone missing after staying late one night. The police found his car in the garage, but he was never seen again. The case went cold, and the company didn't like to talk about it. Kevin dismissed it as a coincidence, but it left me uneasy. That night, I worked late again. When I got to the garage, it felt even quieter than usual. I walked quickly to my car, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that was building with every step. As I drove toward the exit, my headlights caught something in the corner of the lot. It was a shadow, tall and humanoid, standing perfectly still near one of the pillars. My heart dropped. I didn't stop to look closer. I just kept driving. But then, as I approached the gate, I felt something that made my blood run cold. The air in the car felt wrong. It was subtle at first, but then I realized it. I could hear faint breathing. I was alone in the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and my stomach sank. There was someone in the back seat. They were sitting completely still, their face obscured by the shadows. I slammed on the brakes and spun around, but the back seat was empty. My chest was tight, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen. I drove straight home, barely remembering the ride. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning I called my manager and told him I wouldn't be coming back. To this day, I don't know what happened in that garage. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild after hearing Kevin's story, or maybe there's something in that lot that doesn't want to be disturbed. I'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing. I'll never set foot in an underground parking garage again.